Entrepreneurship is at the center of the American economy, or at least that's what we say. Today we'll get stress test on that with a new conversation on Builders Live. Hey, I'm Chris Wink. I'm the co-founder and publisher of Technically, the news organization for the community of technologists and entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship is not another special interest group of many. It is the beginning of the American economy and most economies. At least that's what we Technically think after years of reporting. I'm here to get a sanity check and some help from admittedly a pro-entrepreneurship bringer. John Dearie is the founder and president of the Center for American Entrepreneurship. The hint is in the name. John, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Chris. I'm a huge fan of Technically, and I'm thrilled to meet you finally.
Same. Goes just the same way, John. Appreciate your work. So then I'll start with a softball, but I think I need your way of approaching it. Gut check me. Why is entrepreneurship at the center of your work? Why the focus?
Yes. The focus is, and this is something that I learned comparatively late in my career. The vast majority of my career, Chris, was in banking and financial policy. I started my career at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for 10 years, and then I went to an organization called the Financial Services Forum, which was a policy organization comprised of the CEOs of the 20 largest financial institutions in the United States. I was there for 17 years, and the defining experience of my career prior to starting CAE was the 2008 financial crisis, to which I had a ringside seat. But it was as we were coming out of the financial crisis and the Great Recession, I was the policy director at the forum. I was trying to find ways to new ideas for policymakers to accelerate economic growth and job creation. As you'll recall from those days, everybody was trying to come up with some way to accelerate growth and job creation. The recovery after the Great Recession was painfully slow, despite Washington throwing the kitchen sink at the problem policy-wise. And I began to do my research as to where economic growth and job creation come from. Followed my nose through a lot of the new research at the time. A lot of it came out of the Kauffman Foundation and other places, and showing the following three things that I thought were wildly intriguing. One is that startups, new businesses, are the disproportionate source, which is to say not the only source, but the disproportionate source of innovation in the economy. And that makes sense when you think about it. The one reason why entrepreneurs start a business is they have something new. Sometimes people start a business because they just don't want to work for the man anymore. But a lot of people start a business because they have something new, a new product, a new service, new twist on an old idea. We know from the great work of economist Robert Solow, who won the Nobel Prize for this in 1987, that economic growth is driven by gains in productivity, driven by innovation. So Solow helped establish a straight line connection between the disproportionate source of innovation in the economy, startups, and economic growth. Kauffman and other people also determined subsequently that, and this kind of makes sense if the first thing is true, that startups are responsible for virtually all net new job creation. Again, existing firms do innovate and they do create jobs, but they innovate in less significant ways than startups because they are the establishment and aren't interested in being disrupted. And they also, even though they create jobs, they also shed jobs. As they get better at what they do, as they incorporate capital and technology. And on a net basis, firms older than 5 years old in aggregate that shed about 1 million jobs a year. That means that firms younger than 5 years old, startups, account for virtually all net new job creation. And then the third thing I learned from Kauffman and a bunch of other research at the time was that between the late 70s and the 2020 pandemic, and we can come back to why the pandemic changed things because it's very interesting, but entrepreneurship in America was in decline for 4 decades. And this was work that was done by Kauffman, by Bob Lighton, Ian Hathaway, and other people around the country. So the basic reason why we're so focused on entrepreneurship and startups is their special importance to innovation and therefore economic growth and job creation, and the fact that there was something clearly wrong with American entrepreneurship for 4 decades. And we started CAE because it was our observation that in order to turn that decline around, required changes in public policy, and there was no organization in Washington that was working with policymakers to educate them about everything I just said and to work with them on addressing the problems that were leading to this 4-decade decline in American entrepreneurship.
John, so much of my reporting career has felt like walking a tightrope with terms that carry a lot of cultural connotation, and good and bad, and so it just makes it all messy, right? So, like, as our mutual colleague Victor Wang's Right to Start team likes to often boast, they've done some polling that follows some other work that shows the average American really likes the word entrepreneur. They overwhelmingly associate that with small business, is what they imagine. The pizza shop, the hardware store, it's very visible, understandably. Another sliver of Americans, increasingly, the word entrepreneur is now being associated with kind of like big tech CEO. There was so much media coverage of the founder to CEO pipeline,
Right.
high profile. Both big firms and small firms are not necessarily new firms. So that distinction in our world is crucial. It's something we technically try to do. But help me navigate this, the separation of Main Street commercial corridor, other small business, and what entrepreneurship means, and how you guys use the term in your own work.
Very, very good question. Very important threshold question. So we're all on the same page in terms of what we mean. Small businesses, first of all, very, very important in our economy. If you define small business as 500 or fewer employees, which is the way the SBA does, that sounds awfully big to me. But
Sure.
But if you define it that way, you're talking about 99% of the businesses in the U.S. economy.
Right.
80% of the businesses in the U.S. economy have fewer than 20 employees. So the U.S. economy is a small business economy. Small businesses are enormously important. They employ about 55% of the American workforce. They make up, the main streets of our communities and cities. They're incredibly important to the economy and the social fabric of our communities and our country. Large technology companies also important for all kinds of reasons that I don't need to go into, that everybody understands. Increasingly, those large tech companies, particularly the ones that provide online marketplaces and digital tools and platforms for new and small businesses to operate on, are incredible tools for American entrepreneurship. And that's very important to keep in mind. As a matter of fact, I just did a roundtable in Tampa, Florida last week, focused on precisely that topic, the importance to entrepreneurs of digital platforms and tools. And it was fascinating. We can talk about that later. But what makes new businesses so important, and when I say new, I mean new, and new is defined as, we generally define it as 5 years or less. And the reason why we define it that way is because that's what the research that Kaufman and others have done, that's kind of the critical period in which the economic contribution for which new businesses are so important comes from. It is the newness of those businesses, and in particular, the innovation. That's the real key. It's that new businesses are, as I said earlier, the disproportionate source of innovation in the economy that makes them so important. Now, it's also true that new businesses fail at a very high rate. As you know, about a third of all small businesses fail before their second year, about half before their fifth year. But those that survive, those new businesses that survive, tend to create jobs at very rapid rates. And they also, as I said, contribute innovation in a disproportionate way to the economy, which ultimately drives gains in productivity, drives economic growth. And because it drives economic growth, drives job creation, opportunity expansion, et cetera. So it's the way that I think about new businesses. All aspects of the U.S. economy are important, but new businesses defined as 5 years or younger are the bullseye of economic activity in the U.S., in any economy, but certainly ours.
So much I want to spin off and ask you about there. I got to push forward, but one lingering question, maybe fact check me. I spend a lot of time pushing. A lot of my reporting has led me to this belief that we've gotten stuck in a thorny trap. Small business overwhelmingly beloved by Americans, so sensibly and rationally,
Absolutely.
elected officials often reference them, and it all makes sense. There's a neat package there. But that is also why then entrepreneurship work, I view, often gets seen as like just one of many interest groups. I've been in many rooms with kind of broader policymakers or stakeholders where it's like seen as, yes, we have a program for the bicyclists and we have a program for this special interest group, and we have the small business set aside. It's there. And
Right.
my understanding after my reporting career is the right way that we're trying to do is to try to say, actually, you should think of new business formation as the beginning. It's the start of everything. You end up with more everything if that's working. I guess fact check me. Am I overselling a bill of goods? What's your reading of this research?
No, I think that that's absolutely correct, and it was one of the reasons why we started CAE, Chris, was to reach out to policymakers and to educate them about the differences between existing small businesses, which are very important for all the reasons we've talked about. And we don't mean to take anything away or undermine in any way the story of their importance, the reason why policymakers pay so much attention to them, the reason why they're so popular politically. They're well represented in Washington, D.C., but new businesses were not. And for all the reasons that I've been talking about, new businesses are different in their economic significance, principally as the source of most new innovation in the economy, big, disruptive, major innovation. And because they're new, they're very vulnerable. The analogy I use all the time is they're like toddlers. They have enormous potential, but they're easily knocked off their feet. So problems and frustrations that can be a pain in the neck to existing small businesses can be fatal to new businesses. And therefore, because of their unique economic importance and unique vulnerabilities, new businesses have unique policy needs that policymakers need to be aware of. And they need to think explicitly when they're considering policies that might have bearing on, say, new businesses. And it's important to also think about, and what would the impact be on vulnerable new businesses who are the real, as I said, the bullseye of our economy in so many ways.
I want to talk about one of those obvious, prominent, possible factors to knock folks off their feet, AI. But before I do, one clarification more on that point. You can help me with this. I also understand the culture and the politics that remain thorny in that startup often really implies for more and more Americans high growth, often capitalized with something like venture capital. We technically disproportionately cover those kinds of companies. And for lots of reasons, we do think they're important for starting a regional flywheel. But we get dinged and pushed back from sometimes that we overrepresent in the media generally, and in my role too, a particular kind of high growth new firm startup. Just linger for me on a sec around how big is the category of new in your interpretation? And I imagine everyone starts new. That's how time works.
Right.
And that means you could end up on a track of small, you can end up a track of big, you can have a track of kind of a high growth capitalized. Talk to me a little bit about how you navigate the balance of what the word startup means and how that culture, that connotation carries, what it carries.
So different groups tend to focus on different aspects of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, if you will. Ours is focused on that wide aperture of new, regardless of what sector they're in, regardless of how they're financed. And that's because of the economic importance that, what falls out of the research, the conclusions about the importance of that class of new businesses. Now, only a small sliver, most new businesses are going to go on to be the next generation of Main Street small businesses, right? They're the hair salons, the restaurants, the tax preparers, et cetera. There is a small portion of every cohort of new businesses that are going to be the very high growth, venture backable, venture capital or angel capital backable, high growth new businesses that grow at very rapid rates and create jobs at amazing rates. That's part of American entrepreneurship. That's part of the new group every year. But all of the new group, either those folks who are going to go on to be, the next generation of small businesses on Main Street, the venture-backed group, they're all very important from the standpoint of innovation in different ways, to be sure. But from a public policy standpoint, we focus on the broadest aperture of entrepreneurship that we define as businesses younger than 5 years. Other groups like the Angel Capital Association focus on those businesses backed by angels. The Venture Capital Association focuses on the unique needs and policy priorities of venture-backed, but they all fit. I mean, the way that I put it is our footprint here in Washington is all of entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
These other organizations, the Venture Capital Association, the Angel Capital Association, who we work with all the time and we respect very, very much. They do great work. They have a couple of toes, in the
Right.
broader footprint of entrepreneurship, and that's very important. And we collaborate and work with them all the time. But our footprint is entrepreneurship, broadly defined and defined specifically as all businesses younger than 5 years.
Mm-hmm. I can't escape an interview right now without doing an inevitable AI question. You've written a bit about this. You've done some roundtables. It is entirely rational to say AI threatens to be a tool to support incumbents and strengthen market position. There is also a version of the story that it could be an opportunity for creative destruction and new entrants. What's your read of the moment of how we'll use AI and its effects on new business?
My impression, and this is based on, as we were talking about backstage before we started, Chris, well, first of all, it's really important to understand the intersection between entrepreneurship and any new technology, regardless of what the new technology is. It's AI today, but in the past, it's been, a wide range of technologies. If you look back over the history of the economic landscape, entrepreneurs have always been the tip of the spear of whatever the technology is. They're problem solvers. They take the new technology and they build new businesses that solves problems in unique ways, and they create value and jobs and economic growth by doing that. So if you're going to understand the impact and the implication of a new technology, in this case AI, you really need to understand the intersection of that technology to entrepreneurship, and in both directions. So we wanted to better understand the importance of AI to entrepreneurs. In other words, how are entrepreneurs using the technology to launch and grow new businesses, but also the importance of entrepreneurship to the application and rollout of AI. So the best way to do that in our experience, and we do about 10 or 12 roundtables with entrepreneurs. I mentioned the one we just did in Tampa. We do about 10 or 12 a year. And we get out of Washington, which is a good thing, and travel the country and talk to entrepreneurs. And we did 4 roundtables with AI-focused entrepreneurs in 4 cities last year, in Houston, Miami, Atlanta, and Milwaukee. A wide range of AI-focused entrepreneurs. I mean, just building incredible businesses, incredibly creative, incredibly insightful, ingenious businesses, solving every kind of problem that you can possibly think of using AI. And it's not just that they're automating, the human intensive, energy intensive, nagging sort of headachy aspects of their business. They're using AI to do incredibly cool things like, and aside from solving the specific problem that they're focused on, they're using AI to analyze the businesses of their clients, the folks with whom to whom they sell and with whom they do business. They're using AI to analyze those relationships, to identify problems, inefficiencies, obstacles that those business clients may not even be aware of on their own. And to the extent that the entrepreneurs are able to identify opportunities for improvement with their business clients, they're able to help find solutions to those problems. And that has obvious implication for additional hiring by the entrepreneurs. So, we're constantly talking about the employment displacement possibility of AI, and that's very real, to be sure. I don't mean to downplay that. That is coming at us, and we need policymakers focused on how to prepare for that. And CA has been involved in that to some extent. But it's also true that AI is a historic opportunity for entrepreneurs to build new businesses, solve problems, create value, create jobs. And I think it's going to be very, very positive for entrepreneurship. It'll be positive for certain incumbents as well, but it'll be very, very positive for American entrepreneurship.
Let me linger there for a sec, and I got time for one last question at close. But before I get to that last one, we technically recently did an analysis that it's going to be unsurprising to you, but since the mid 1990s, the rise of non-employer firms has outpaced the rise of employer firms. What we've really lost is some in the middle. And in a simplified narrative, that's coming in two forms, those non-employer firms. The optimistic story, the tale we tell, and we technically have done some of these stories, is the dream of the one-person billion-dollar company, or the heavily efficient opportunity, a more distributed version of an American economy. There's a scarier version of that story, and we've also done those stories technically of the as gig work gets widened, and so like the Lyft story, the Lyft driver living in poverty branches out also to the graphic designer who's now gets more flexibility but is at more ad hoc work. And a generation ago, that graphic design job might have been full-time in a larger firm, and now they've become smaller firm. AI feels to be deeply related to this, or at least we assume. Obviously, the big story is how much there's noise in this data at this point. But a lot of us assume that we're going to eventually see AI's effects in efficiencies in the super tiny non-employer firms. But I have my worries about whether our entrepreneurship boom will also leave more Americans in more precarious places. So just counsel me, John Dearie. How are you feeling with that AI optimism you mentioned ago? How are you feeling in a world where there are more non-employer firms, where Americans are doing this kind of K-shaped economy thing in entrepreneurship too? Some are thriving and some are falling behind. What's your level of optimism for that cohort?
I do think there is a danger that you're talking about, both in terms of non-employer firms. And I think at some point, we're already seeing very, very valuable firms with a dozen or fewer employees. Right. And at some point, I was just talking to a friend of mine here in Washington yesterday over coffee, and we both predicted that we're going to see at some point the solopreneur unicorn, the billion-dollar value company that has one employee, its founder, assisted by AI. It's going to happen at some point. That worries me for sure. I think the answer to that is we need to make it as easy as possible, and this is the reason why the work that our friend Victor Huang and his colleagues at Right to Start is so important. We need to make it as easy as possible for every American who wants to do it to be able to start a company. What AI is doing, it is dramatically reducing the cost and difficulty and obstacles to start a company. It's the best time ever to start a company. I worry too that new companies are going to be hiring and creating fewer jobs because of AI. That implies to me that we need many, many, many more startups. But then you also get into the realm of social policy and equality and justice, et cetera. Policymakers are going to have a big role to play here to make sure that, through other policies, not directly related to entrepreneurship, but other social policies, to make sure that everybody benefits at least to some degree from the AI revolution, and to make sure that nobody gets left behind. Because ultimately, AI needs the buy-in of the American people, or there's going to be huge populist blowback with all kinds of damage done to the economy and our democracy. Technology is always scary. The development of the automobile scared the hell out of the whip and buggy makers. What makes AI different is the speed with which it's developing and rolling out. I mean, it's just to think about how fast the last 2 years have gone in terms of the development of AI, and policymakers are behind the eight ball. They are behind the eight ball, both in developing guardrails for the safe development of AI, and they're not really thinking about what are we going to do if a lot of these predictions that we're hearing from the developers of AI about employment displacement, if those are even fractionally correct. 10% unemployment, 15%, we're going to have an enormous problem. So there is lots of work for public policy to do here to make sure that this technology works for everyone. But as long as we work together, the innovation and the policy community, that's CAE's job. We established CAE to be an intermediary, if you will, between the innovation community and the policy community here in Washington. We have lots of work to do, but if we do it, I'm very confident that it's going to be a great era for human transformation.
I think I was going to ask you a follow-up question, but I don't think I can do better than that. The optimistic note, John believes we can do it. I have to go out with that bit of optimism because I've run out of time. John Dearie is the founder and president of the Center for American Entrepreneurship. John, I know we'll be talking again. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Chris.
See everyone next time. See ya.